it's happened and Russia has done it. So what does it look like? It looks like a Russian opposition leader getting hauled out of his bed in the middle of the night in Vilnius and someone trying to repeatedly hit him in the head with a hammer. It looks like people setting fire to branches of IKEA. It looks like ships dragging their anchors over half a dozen data and electricity cables at the bottom of the sea in the middle of the night. It looks like a plot to assassinate the chief executive of Germany's largest arms manufacturer.
Hey, it's Marcel Dirsus, and this is The Next Best. The Baltic is perhaps the world's greatest geopolitical flashpoint, and this week I had the pleasure of discussing it with Oliver Moody. Oliver is a Berlin correspondent for The Times and the author of a book named Baltic. We discussed the history of NATO expansion, Germany's rearmament, and the future of Europe. Our conversation was surprisingly hopeful, and I enjoyed it a great deal. Let's go. Hey, Oliver. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed for having me on.
I really enjoyed the book. It was a great read. I had a lot of fun. Before we get to the wider region, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the three Baltic states. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Could you perhaps give us a bit of an overview of the 20th century history of these countries, perhaps up until the end of the Cold War?
But how many hours do we have for this?
Not a lot. I know it's not going to be perfect, but, we got to give listeners some context.
Okay, so I am concertinaing 100 years into 90 seconds here, but at the start of the 20th century, the three Baltic states are basically provinces of the Russian Empire and have been since the 18th century. And at the end of the First World War, they win their independence for the first time in these incredibly complicated and grueling wars that involve like the Poles and the Bolsheviks and the White Russians and the remnants of the German military, the Freikorps, and then there's a weird kind of Russo-German, like the Wagner company of its day that gets involved. Anyway, they come out of that with some support from the British Royal Navy and establish independent republics for the first time in their history. But they have massive problems coordinating between themselves and with their neighbors. And over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, the Western powers quickly conclude that their independence is not sustainable. And so when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact happens in 1939, Estonia and Latvia, and then a bit later, Lithuania, are assigned to the Soviet sphere of influence. The Western Europeans don't really lift a finger in their defense. They are forced to sign friendship treaties with Moscow, and Stalin puts military bases on their territory. Then a few months later, they are annexed into the USSR by rigged referenda. That lasts for about a year. Then they are invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany for 3 years before the Red Army comes back in 1944. And at that point, they enter Soviet occupation that will last for nearly half a century. And people in the Baltic states will often say that from their perspective, the Second World War only really ended in 1991.
Yeah, I guess we have this perspective of talking about countries being liberated at the end of World War II, but obviously to these people, it didn't feel like that at all. And then how did they become independent at the end of the Cold War? What did that actually look like? How did it work?
So basically, the national movements had always been there, right? They never entirely went away, and there were always these kind of little bubbles of subversion coming up. But that really began to become a serious movement under Gorbachev and his policy of perestroika. And the national movements in the three Baltic states, really operating in parallel, took advantage of those growing liberties, started pushing the boundaries, initially campaigning for autonomy within the USSR. But as they got more and more confident, they started pressing for full independence. Lithuania was the first to formally reassert its independence in early 1990, and Gorbachev responded with a massive, pretty much full-scale economic blockade. I did a bunch of research in the diplomatic archives about this period, and it's very clear that the Western powers, the US, West Germany, France, the UK, gave Lithuania no encouragement whatsoever, for reasons we can go into later if you're interested. But basically, this was something that the Lithuanians did on their own, very bravely, very unilaterally. And in the end, what tipped the balance was not any outside intervention from the West, but rather the failure of the coup against Gorbachev in the summer of 1991. And that was the point where the Baltic republics started to get international recognition, starting with smaller states, then eventually reaching the US.
So why at that point was there no Western support for this?
This was basically because the big Western countries were betting very heavily on Gorbachev as the agent for détente. And they were very worried that the national movements in the Baltic states would destabilize him and give ammunition to his critics and opponents within the Soviet apparatus. And in particular, the West Germans were very worried that giving too much encouragement to the Lithuanians would jeopardize reunification, which was a very live issue at that point, because when Lithuania reasserts its independence, we are like 2 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there was like a lot of tacit pressure put on the Lithuanians by all of these countries to back down. Like there was one occasion when the Lithuanian prime minister went to Washington and they would only let her in through the tourist entrance of the White House in case having her through a more formal entrance made it look like some kind of diplomatic recognition.
It's amazing in a sense that it worked out at all, right? Given the international environment, given all that history of Russia. But so fast forward, these countries are now independent. It's an incredibly difficult situation. Economically, the wider region is kind of a mess. Everything is in flux. Why did these countries decide that they wanted to turn west, that they wanted to join the European Union, that they wanted to join NATO? Because now I think oftentimes when we talk about NATO enlargement, we make it seem almost as if these countries were forced to join the Western Bloc, whereas in reality, they obviously had good reasons to want to.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer really goes back to the first question when we were talking about that period between the two world wars when the three Baltic countries first won their independence. And they were unable to form any meaningful kind of regional military alliance. And despite having had a bit of support initially from the UK, they were basically left on their own by the 1930s. And they were absolutely determined not to repeat that mistake and recognized that the absolutely overriding central strategic priority for their governments had to be NATO accession via joining every single Western club that they could. So they go into like the OSCE, they go into the European Union, they go into basically anyone that will have them to strengthen the case that they need to get into NATO. They are battering down the door into the alliance. You think about the extent of the Baltic states' participation in the invasion of Iraq, for example, where they weren't even in NATO at that point, but they wanted to show that they were really, really good allies. And they were doing this, certainly in the 1990s, in the teeth of a great deal of skepticism, not just from the Clinton administration, but from other big players in NATO.
So when you talk about that skepticism, was that skepticism essentially because there were concerns that it might provoke Russia? Or, again, what was the reasoning of the Western powers? Why were some of them so skeptical?
So in the 1990s, what we now call the European security architecture was very much in flux. And no one really knew, once this snow globe had been shaken up, where the flakes were going to land and what the long-lasting arrangement would be with Russia, particularly once Yeltsin lost power. And so it was partly a geostrategic concern about being on the hook for the defense of these three countries, which is just a logistically, intrinsically very difficult thing to do. But it was also partly a concern about like what NATO is for and how it relates to Russia, particularly before the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 kind of stabilized and to some degree clarified the relationship.
Yeah, so on that question about it being so difficult to defend these countries, obviously working on the book, you've talked to a lot of soldiers, generals, intelligence officials. Can you just get into that a little bit? I mean, why is it so difficult to defend these three countries?
It is basically geography, right? If you look at the map, you have Russia to the east, Belarus to the south, and then you have this very kind of slender, I think it's about 60-kilometer stretch of Polish-Lithuanian border known as the Suwałki Corridor. That is the only land route across NATO territory through which you can reinforce the Baltic countries. So if you have a war, you either have to have all of your forces already in position, or you have to bring in reinforcements and extra supplies. You could do that by air, but it's probably going to get shot out of the sky. You could do that by sea, but the sea is probably going to be intensely contested, or you can do it through this gap. And just, it's very intrinsically difficult. They're also like super narrow. If you take the map of the Russian gains that have been made in Ukraine since 2014 and transpose it onto the southern Baltic, it basically covers the entire thing. Like they really do not have a lot of space to trade away for trying to reorganize and gain some kind of strategic advantage.
Moving away from the Baltics as a sort of vulnerability for the alliance, but also for the European Union, you argue in the book that there are actually a lot of things that we can learn from these countries as well. It's not just a problem. They've done a great deal of incredible things, and we should look at them and learn from them. Estonia at independence was a poor country. And since then, their development has just been phenomenal. How did they do it?
Well, this is one of the really core arguments of the book. And I would make it not just about the Baltic states, but also about Finland and Poland in particular, that at various points in the 20th century, they were forced by historical circumstance to do a hard reboot of the state and to sit there collectively as the ruling elite and think, what are our challenges and what assets do we have and how do we deploy those assets long term to best meet those challenges? And in Estonia's case, there was, despite a fair degree of superficial political turmoil, a lot of prime ministers rising and falling over the 1990s, a extraordinary degree of elite consensus that they had a country the size of the Netherlands with a population the size of San Diego's, with very few natural resources, very little really competitive industry left over from the Soviet occupation era. And they had to find some way, first of all, of preserving their country's independence, and second, of gaining comparative economic advantage. And so in strategic terms, the first question was answered with NATO membership and integration into the West. And the second was answered by saying, well, we have got human capital, we've got excellent technical education, so let's use that. We have this emerging technology, the internet. Let's essentially skip the analog stage of modernity. Let's skip the checkbooks and the landlines and just go straight to the digital stage. So they put computers and modems inside every school at a time when this would have been extremely patchy in somewhere like the UK or Germany. They borrowed a lot of emerging digital policies from neighboring countries and just did them an awful lot better. So there's things like digital ID, which already existed in Finland but was made mandatory in Estonia, or like tax returns that would be pre-populated with answers. Again, those existed on paper in Denmark, but the Estonians took them and made them digital, and they wired them together really systematically into a national strategy that was tremendously effective at essentially rebuilding the national administration and creating a very effective tech sector.
What do you think we can learn from that more generally? I mean, I guess one takeaway from that is that if things get really tough and you really sit down and you make strategic decisions and you follow through, you can have great success. But that clearly doesn't apply to all of the European countries. So what can bigger countries take away from that, do you think?
So I think we have a tendency to look at the frontline countries now and say, we really admire some aspects of your policy, whether that's digital administration or defense or how they run conscription or whatever, or the education system in the case of Finland and Estonia. So let's just borrow that policy and transplant it and see if it works. And most often, they don't even get to the implementation phase. And I think the problem is that they are not going through the underlying reboot phase of thinking, again, to put it back to that original question, what are the challenges and what are the assets that we have to meet those challenges? Now, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland were forced to go through that process. But I also think it is really salutary if you're sitting in London or Paris or Berlin or wherever to think, if we were going to do that today, what would be the great strategic challenges facing us today? Where would we want our countries to be in 30, 40, 50 years' time, given the emerging economic and technological landscape? What advantages do we have? And how do we essentially very fundamentally reconfigure our state to achieve those objectives?
I want to pivot from those three particular Baltic states to the region more generally. Clearly, Russia's full scale of invasion of Ukraine had a tremendous impact on the region. What did it mean to them?
Yeah, so for the Nordic countries on the Baltic, Denmark, Sweden and Finland, it was absolutely revolutionary because it made it clear that Russia was willing to attack a neighboring country with everything that it could throw at it. And it obviously tipped the balance in very long-standing debates in Sweden and Finland in favor of NATO accession, which is a huge, huge, huge geopolitical and defense reorientation. The Danish state has completely changed its relationship with the military. They're essentially rebuilding their defense apparatus from the ground up. They've literally just started reconstructing ground-based air defense, which they had actually abandoned at the start of the 2000s because they believed there was no threat that would necessitate it. In Poland and the Baltic countries, I think it was a acceleration of a process that had actually really started with the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, which had led NATO to start putting the so-called enhanced forward presence battle groups on the ground in those 4 countries. From their perspective, the big changes have been like everyone else getting it in terms of the threat from Russia and the urgency of the need for rearmament. Their own administrations getting it to a degree that they hadn't done so before. Defense spending is now on a trajectory to be way over 5% and in some cases over 6% in Poland and the 3 Baltic states. Sweden and Finland joining NATO makes a huge difference from the perspective of their strategic geography. One really interesting question to which you will get a wide variety of answers is whether they feel safer today than they did before the full-scale invasion, because the net sum of those changes is pretty ambivalent and really depends how you weigh the obvious demonstration of Russia's lack of impediments to expansionism against all of the movements on the NATO side that have been in their favor.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways they're also more powerful almost because they were right. I mean, the Baltic countries, for example, seem to have a lot more influence on European policymaking now than they used to, right?
Well, this is a really interesting question. If you look at the makeup of the current European Commission around Ursula von der Leyen, you have Finnish and Latvian vice presidents in charge of key policy portfolios, economics, digital policy, security. You have a Lithuanian defense commissioner, an Estonian high representative, a Polish budget commissioner. Von der Leyen, I think, has grasped the Baltic mindset much, much more effectively than any commission president before her. And that is positive. But at the same time, we have also seen, I guess, a fragmentation of security policy to the point where we've now recognized that the European Union is really, really good for doing some things, particularly to do with defense industrial policy. But for other things like coordinating support for Ukraine or talking to Donald Trump, it's pretty useless. And so what we are now seeing is this emerging set of new constellations like the Weimar Five, Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and the UK, or the so-called coalition of the willing, the various Ukraine supporters, in which the Baltic countries are very often marginalized. And there's a certain irony here because this way of doing business in foreign policy wonk jargon, it's known as flexilateralism, is very much like the operating system on which the Baltic Sea's international politics have been running for the past 30, 35 years. But we're now reaching a point where they are often not in the room when the most important decisions are being made. And there are some interesting things you can say about why that is and how they might get back into the room. But I would almost say we've now passed the point where they've used that vindication and that regained authority to its kind of maximum effect. And the next question is how we move on.
I mean, I guess for at least for the Baltic countries, you know, when you talk about sort of an increase in their power, at some point they just come up against reality because they just don't have that many people. Their economies are not that big. So while they might be more willing to use the capabilities that they have, there simply isn't enough for them to really make them a big player in Europe.
Yeah. There is something to be said for that. And in some ways, I think that is what you could observe. But on the other side of the equation, we are in a period where the biggest players in Europe just don't have a lot of strategic bandwidth for various reasons. I mean, the UK and France have been consumed by their own fiscal problems and domestic politics. Germany, very reluctant to be seen to take leadership, at least in a kind of assertive way, of Europe. Again, partly for domestic political reasons, partly because of the reservations that some of their neighbours have. And so I think there is still a great deal of scope for more forward-thinking countries to take strategic initiatives because there is a kind of a lack of a sense of direction from elsewhere. The question is, how is that coordinated and expressed? And in this framework, I think Poland is actually the kind of crucial player. Certainly when I wrote the book last year, there were very high hopes that Donald Tusk, having come back as Prime Minister at the end of 2023 and expressed this much more like northern directed foreign policy to make Poland a player in the Baltic, would emerge as like the shop steward for northeastern Europe, who could kind of synthesize the concerns and interests of these countries with its own and then put them on the table almost with equal weight to France or Germany. And one of the disappointments, I think, from the perspective of the northeastern Europeans is that has not happened. And that's partly a function of Tusk having to work with a president who has been put there to be a wrecking ball to his administration. But even before that, I think these frustrations were starting to emerge.
You mentioned that NATO expanded in the north. It seems there wasn't really that much pushback from Moscow when that happened. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, because, I mean, the Russians have been complaining about an expansion of NATO for forever, saying they don't want to be surrounded, they don't want NATO on their borders. And yet when it happened and a significant chunk of NATO border, so to speak, was added, they didn't really seem to do much. Why do you think that is? Was it because they decided there's not much that they could do to really prevent it, or what's the deal?
I mean, this was a very rapidly moving process in 2022. The impulse for joining it might obviously have taken Sweden in particular longer to get into the alliance because Turkey and Hungary were holding the process up. But this was something that moved very fast at a time when Russia's attention was overwhelmingly absorbed in Ukraine. Another consideration is the difference between what Russia says and what Russia does. So for whatever reason, the Kremlin clearly felt that aside from trying to kind of shrug these developments off as not being of any great strategic significance, which was a PR strategy in itself, right? In the longer term, this clearly did pose a threat, particularly because it gives NATO via Finland the possibility to absolutely destroy the route between the Northern Fleet and the vast majority of Russia's nuclear assets up on the Kola Peninsula in the far north and St. Petersburg. And what we have seen since then has been a reorganization of the Russian military. We've seen the creation of a new core base at Petrozavodsk, which is about 3 hours drive away from the Finnish-Karelian border. So it's not that Russia has just sat by and done nothing. We have very clearly seen kind of organizational level preparations to try and reorient the Russian military in the long term to take account of this development.
There's a lot of public debate when it comes to this question of war against Russia. Are we at war against Russia already? Are we in some sort of hybrid conflict with Russia? I don't love the term hybrid warfare, but obviously the problem is real. The Russians are doing a lot of things that they shouldn't be doing, particularly in the Baltic region. Can you just go a little bit into that? I mean, what does that actually look like for these countries?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if there is a form of hostility that one country can inflict on another that falls below the level of outright military conflict, it's happened, and Russia has done it. Not just to the Baltic states, but to the Baltic states in particular, partly because of just geographical proximity. So what does it look like? It looks like a Russian opposition leader getting hauled out of his bed in the middle of the night in Vilnius and someone tried to repeatedly hit him in the head with a hammer. It looks like people setting fire to branches of IKEA. It looks like ships dragging their anchors over half a dozen data and electricity cables at the bottom of the sea in the middle of the night. It looks like Russian drones flying over airports or en masse into Polish airspace. It looks like Russian fighter jets, again, encroaching into neighboring countries' airspace. It looks like a plot to assassinate the chief executive of Germany's largest arms manufacturer. It's really, really broad, and it's very, very, very deep. And whether you call it war or not is just basically a kind of terminological question of what you think a war is.
Yeah. And despite that all, obviously, there's also the fear that Russia could actually invade one of these countries, in particular, perhaps a country like Estonia. What would that concrete scenario like? I mean, like, what is the fear? What is the concern? What could a Russian invasion of Estonia actually look like? Hey, it's me. Apologies for the interruption. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and subscribe to the podcast. I've been told that it really helps, so that'd be great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to be said is that if Russia were to mount a full-scale invasion through the Baltic states, we wouldn't just be looking at one single axis. We would probably be looking at multiple axes via Belarus. So I don't know if I would want to single out Estonia for this version of a NATO-Russia war, but there is a version in which the Kremlin derives some kind of casus belli from the local Russian-speaking population. It might be, discontent in the northeast of Estonia, where that part of the population is very concentrated. It might be the kind of fabricated claims that the Russian Orthodox Church is being persecuted, whatever. I mean, Putin wants his casus belli, he makes his casus belli. The Russian military grabs a fairly small amount of land close to the border and says, what are you going to do about it? And the way that scenario plays out varies a lot depending on who you talk to. The Estonians get very angry if you talk about these kind of scenarios because they say, look, we have been doing nothing for these past 30 years except preparing for this scenario. Our entire military and intelligence apparatus is geared up to not allowing this to happen. The moment the Russians tried anything like this, we would be fighting back right from the first inch of Estonian terrain, hitting targets on Russian territory. And the Russians know this, so this is ludicrous. And there is a lot of merit to that argument. But there is also a wider consideration, which is what the rest of NATO does. And this is why Trump's return to the White House is so fundamentally destabilizing. Because if there is a concern that Estonia or whichever other country finds itself in this situation and says at the North Atlantic Council, guys, this is a very obvious, unambiguous Article 5 situation, and the Americans say, nothing to do with us, then every other NATO member in Europe has to ask itself, well, what do we do? And that also applies to the UK, which has its battle group on the ground at Tapa, sort of a 90-minute drive away from the border.
You mentioned the UK, but obviously other countries are doing this too. Why are they putting their troops in these places? Like, what's the logic behind that?
So the logic has changed, right? This really dates back to 2014 when the Russian occupation of Crimea led to a rash of speculation that the Baltic states would be next in the firing line. And as a result, two things happened within NATO. The first was the formation of the so-called Joint Expeditionary Force, which is basically a Northern European NATO sub-alliance led by the UK that is just supposed to be a bit more flexible and reactive in this kind of situation. And then the second thing that happened was the decision to create the Enhanced Forward Presence deployments. In military terms, these deployments were historically pretty nugatory. You're talking about, sort of between 1,000 and 1,500 troops in each of the three Baltic states, each led by a different framework nation. Now, since 2022, that logic has changed a bit because the idea used to be basically that if Russia wants to fight its way into one of these Baltic states, it's going to have to kill people from other NATO countries. And if you kill people from other NATO countries, you're ultimately tangling with nuclear-armed powers, and that is a very bad idea. This is the so-called Tripwire theory. But now we're moving towards a position where certainly in Lithuania and to a lesser degree in Latvia, it's actually meant to be a serious conventional deterrent in its own right. So Germany is putting a brigade that's about 5,000 personnel, fully equipped with, Leopard 2 battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles on the ground in Lithuania. That should be there by the end of 2027. In Latvia, the Canadians have already stood up a pretty light brigade, about 2,500 troops with extra support from about a dozen other NATO members. The odd one out is actually the British deployment in Estonia, which has been kept at battle group size, basically because the UK is so short on personnel that they argue they just can't spare any more soldiers.
Talking about conventional defense and, conventional deterrence, you have an entire chapter about Finland in the book, and I think it's fascinating. So in this context, what can other countries learn from Finland?
Yeah. The real lesson of the Finnish model, I think, is we chuck around terms, or at least people who work on security in Europe chuck around terms like whole of society defense, whole of society resilience, without it really being clear what that means. Like, what does it really mean for me to tell the average person in like Kaiserslautern or Nice that they're responsible for the resilience of their country? And Finland actually gives you an extremely detailed, well thought through model of how that works. And what it essentially boils down to is that a society's defenses run way, way deeper than just guns and bombs and have to extend to things like media literacy or knowing precisely what to do and where to go in a crisis, having enough bunkers to protect your population from an air raid, having plans that you have developed with NGOs and corporations for exactly who does what in an emergency situation, who controls the trains, where the food comes from, who's responsible for backup electricity generation. Can manufacturers switch production from, socks to military garments or from basic metal goods to ammunition? And these have been developed over the course of decades. And what we're now seeing is that the more forward-thinking Western European countries, in particular Germany, are studying these preparations very closely and reforming their own kind of civil military planning correspondingly with Finland and also Sweden as their templates.
Why do you think there aren't more countries that are doing that type of thing? I mean, I get the sense that in Germany, for example, there's always a concern by the government to not scare the population. So they would rather have the population be unprepared than scared, because if they're scared, then that might be bad during the next election. Is that the problem? Is that why not more countries are doing this?
There are two problems. And the first is it's not a political priority, because most voters, certainly in the UK and France, to a lesser degree, but still to a meaningful degree in Germany, don't realise how serious the situation is and how much danger there would be directly to their country's territory if there were a NATO-Russia war. There's still a kind of prevailing assumption, I think, that if there is a war, it'll be something happening far away in northeastern Europe, and we might contribute some troops, we might fire some missiles and do a bit of cyber stuff, but fundamentally, it's not threatening to us. And having talked to a lot of generals all over Europe over the past 3 years, I can say that is not what the generals think. The generals are really, really worried about our countries in Western Europe being in the firing line if this happens. So there's that level, just the kind of the gap between what the securocrats expect to happen and what the populations expect to happen. And then the other difficulty, I think, is just the fact that the legal structures are not set up for a transition into wartime. And here, I'll talk about Germany just because it's the example that I know best. You've got federal structures, you've got regional structures, you've got district level structures with a whole confused chain of responsibility for who buys what and who's in charge of overseeing what. In some cases, you can't move kit around between different regions without a whole new set of paperwork and regulatory standards. If you want to formally acknowledge that the country has been attacked, you require a 2/3 majority of votes in the Bundestag, which, given that the radical left and the radical right currently command more than 1/3 of the seats in the Bundestag, is far from necessarily a given. So there are just all of these really awkward legal hindrances to putting these preparations in place. And Germany's now actually starting to get serious about this. The Bundeswehr, the armed forces, have set up what's called the Joint Forces Services Command, the Unterstützungskommando, who are making the preparations for exactly this scenario, working with the civilian authorities. But it's a long, long road that they've got to travel.
To stay on Germany for a moment, Germany is obviously rearming a lot more slowly than some people would have wished for, but it is rearming. It is spending hundreds of billions on tanks and drones and ammunition. How do policymakers and government officials view Germany's rearmament in light of history? I mean, is there a concern in other European countries that Germany's rearming and that its military power is growing?
There's a famous line from Radosław Sikorski back when he was Poland's defense minister in 2011. He came to Berlin and he said in a speech that the thing I fear is not German action, it's German inaction. And the criticism that I hear most often from representatives of neighboring countries is not what is Germany going to do with all these tanks and bombs. It is why doesn't Germany have more tanks and bombs? And can we really rely on the Germans to come and fight for us if we're attacked? So I think overwhelmingly the concerns in the frontline states are just immediate. It's about getting through to 2030 with as much of NATO deterrence in place as we can manage. That said, certainly in Poland, there is definitely an undercurrent of worry about the rise of the AfD and the way in which certain AfD leaders have flirted with implications that all of these territories that were once German on the other side of the Oder-Neisse line might on some level still be German in their identity. This is very much a kind of submerged aspect of German politics. It is nothing like as salient as it used to be in the 1970s or the 1980s before reunification. But, Polish people have very long memories, and that mistrust is very, very deep. And I mean, honestly, should the AfD end up controlling the German federal government, which is not on the cards anytime in the next couple of years, but if you think a decade ahead, it's not completely implausible, then I also think kind of all bets are off.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is the United States? Because obviously a lot of the countries in the region have tied their security to the United States, that they trust the Americans a lot more than they trust the other Europeans, like the Germans or the French, for example. So what does the state of American politics mean to these countries?
It means everything. Like last week, I was at a conference in one of the Baltic states when news of the so-called 28-point plan dropped. And it went off like a bomb, because if the United States enforces an extremely uneven peace on Ukraine, that doesn't just have direct implications for the security situation of the frontline states of NATO. It also signals something about how the Trump administration views those states themselves. And as a result, there has been an unbelievable amount of energy that has gone into the transatlantic relationship from these countries on two levels. First of all, on the kind of surface level, there is a whole kabuki theater exercise in reassuring their own publics that the US has got their back, and in basically telling the US, you will not find better allies in the world than you have in us. But also behind the scenes, there is a gigantic amount of work going on. First of all, in terms of passing the various currents in the US administration and how they feel about NATO, and particularly the level of the US military presence on the eastern flank. But also, in some countries, people are starting to draw up plans for what happens in a nightmare scenario where Russia attacks NATO and the Americans don't come to our support, and how on earth you sustain the defense of Europe under those circumstances, and what kind of frameworks of bilateral or multilateral sub-NATO alliances you need in that kind of situation.
Is there a concern that these types of scenarios could almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because sometimes when I discuss this sort of topic with people, they almost don't want to entertain the thought that it may happen, because even discussing it could make it more likely.
Yeah. I mean, this is extremely subterranean policy planning. And from as far as I can tell, and you can never say for sure in these questions, because there might be some level of government where it's happening and you're just not aware of it. But I've been super interested in, if you go to London or you go to Berlin, are they thinking about these scenarios? And I found no evidence that they are, for exactly the reason that you just said, that just to contemplate this question, especially if it leaked out into the public, would in itself undermine NATO deterrence and make it easier for the US to detach from Europe. So it's extremely sensitive, to the point where I don't even want to talk about which countries are having these discussions. But those discussions are starting to happen. And I think they really do illustrate the depth of alarm and just how unsettled the European NATO countries really are about the state of the transatlantic alliance.
I guess I've got a bit of a philosophical question that might be a little bit unfair. But if the United States were to disengage from Europe, and let's say there's not a Russian invasion, so there's not like an imminent threat that needs to be taken care of, do you think American disengagement from Europe would lead to more unity, or do you think it would lead to more division? Because I think there are smart people on both sides of this debate, and I just wonder where you land.
I don't think it's a philosophical question at all. I think it's a practical question that we're already starting to answer, right? And I think the answer is both. Like, I don't think most of us in Europe appreciate the extent to which American security guarantees have been the binding agent that held the European project together from the start of the post-war era to the present, and the extent to which, once you take those security guarantees away, or at least cast serious doubt on them, the rest of the European project starts to unravel. So in that sense, we are going through like a profoundly disintegrative moment for Europe. But in the other, as I alluded, on the other side of it, as I alluded to in the answer to one of the earlier questions, I also think there are strong integrative forces where there is a real sense that this is existential for Europe. And it is directly existential because of Russia, but it's also indirectly existential because we're questioning whether our future economic model is going to be viable and whether our demographic models are viable. And in that sense, I think the remit of the European Union may be shrinking in terms of policy areas, but its coordinating power is still huge. And also the emergence of these other constellations, especially in the security policy domain, is not a threat to the continued existence or coherence or unity of Europe. I think it's just the coexistence of lots of different alignments of countries, and that Europe as a whole actually ends up stronger at the end of that process.
That's very hopeful. The full title of your book is Baltic, the Future of Europe. Why do you think that this region is key to the future of Europe?
I think it's key to the future of Europe in a passive sense and in an active sense. The passive sense is very obvious, and it's one that we are very used to talking about. And that is that if there is a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, this is where it is likeliest to happen. This is where our deterrence is focused. This is where the impulse for rearmament and the securitization of other policy areas is coming from. But it's also, I think, a model for the future in an active sense, in terms, in particular, of the willingness to be unintimidated by Russian rhetoric and nuclear blackmail, and also to go on the offensive and take the initiative and not to be scared of going up the escalation ladder with the Russians, but also, in a broader sense, the perspective on history that this part of the world has had over the past 30 to 35 years has been one overwhelmingly of change for the better, especially in Poland and the three Baltic states. They have come out of a period of servitude and oppression, and the change that has happened in those countries in the course of our lifetimes has overwhelmingly been positive. And I think that has come with an attitude to change and instability that accepts that these are just parts of the historical process that you have to live with and that you have to make the best of, rather than being stuck in a defensive mindset where you're just trying to preserve the kind of supposed paradise that human civilization hit in the 1990s.
One more question before I let you go. You've been to all these places, you've talked to all these people. Is there any one encounter that has really stuck with you and that was just really memorable to you?
The encounter that has really stuck in my memory the most was actually here in Berlin, where I'm based, with a exiled Russian writer called Viktor Yerofeyev, who for decades, stretching back to the communist era, had been a guy who was just on the inside of what it was politically possible to do with satire and political literature, and had managed to keep that position in the twilight zone between what was acceptable and what was unacceptable through all the years of Putin, and had then decided in 2022, after the start of the full-scale invasion, that that twilight zone no longer existed and that it was no longer possible to be a satirical novelist living in Moscow. And so he drove all the way via the Finnish border and then got a boat over to the Baltic states, and then eventually drove all the way down through northeastern Europe to Germany. And I asked him, what does Russia want from us? Why is it doing all of the things that it's doing to us? Does it have territorial design? Does it want to destabilize NATO? Is it genuinely worried about its own security? And he said, yes, all of those things and more. You have to understand that all of these complexes are overlaid on top of each other in Russia's political culture, and that the aggression that Russia visits on its Western neighbors is kind of over-determined. It's not monocausal. And as an analytical framework for thinking about Russia, that really did change the way that I see it.
All right. Thank you very much for joining me. That was fun.
Thank you. It was great.
That's it for this episode. If you want to stay in touch, like the podcast and subscribe. And if you have feedback or suggestions, leave a comment. I'll see you soon.